He was 99 years old when he heard his own name change. No warning. No ceremony. Just a voice, and sand under his knees, and a promise too large for his body to hold. His neighbors would laugh when they heard what he was called now. They already laughed at less. This is Abraham, but that was not always his name. You have heard names before. You have said them in church, in Sunday school, maybe without ever asking why they mattered. A name in the ancient world was not a label. It was a claim on your future. And 5 times in Scripture, God reached into a life already lived and gave it a new one. Not a nickname. A new identity spoken over a person who had not yet become it. You are about to meet all 5. This is not a story about names. This is not a story about ancient grammar. This is not a story about family records. This is a story about every time God looked at someone and called them by who they were going to become long before they had any evidence he was right. And there is a 5th name in this story. It is not written in the pages of Scripture the way the others are. It was given to a whole community in a city called Antioch, and if you are watching this, there is a real chance you are still carrying it. We will get there. But not yet. First, a man too old to be a father, a woman too old to be a mother, and a promise that made both of them laugh before it made them weep. 99 years old. Say that number out loud, and you already feel it in your knees. Abram had spent decades chasing a promise. God made him back when he still lived in his father's house in a city called Ur, surrounded by people who worshipped different gods entirely. He left anyway. He walked into a land he had never seen, on the strength of a voice he could not prove. If you have ever made a decision that made no sense to the people around you, you already understand something about Abram before we even get to his new name. And then, at 99, God changed the terms. Not just the promise, the name. Abram, which meant exalted father, became Abraham, father of many nations. You need to understand how that must have sounded. He had no nations. He had no son. He had a wife, Sarai, who was 89, and a lifetime of watching that particular hope die a little more every year. If you have ever waited on something you were promised, watching the years pass and the odds get worse, you already know how that wait feels in the body. God changed her name too. Sarai became Sarah, princess, mother of nations. And when Abraham heard the promise attached to that new name, that Sarah herself would bear the child, Scripture says he laughed, fell on his face and laughed, right there in the dirt. Not mockery. Disbelief that had nowhere else to go. You would probably have laughed too. Here is what most people miss about this moment. The names came before the proof. God did not wait for Isaac to be born and then rename his parents in celebration. He renamed them first. He called them by who they would become while they were still laughing at the idea of it. You are allowed to sit with how strange that is. Hold on to that, because the next name change looks nothing like this one, and yet it is the same hand doing the work. Jacob was not laughing when his name changed. Jacob was terrified. And if you have ever been afraid of facing someone you wronged, you are closer to this story than you think. He had spent his whole life taking what wasn't his. He took his brother Esau's birthright over a bowl of stew. He took his brother's blessing with a lie and a disguise made of goat skin. He ran from that lie for 20 years, built a family, built wealth, and then turned around to face the one person he had wronged most, Esau, marching toward him with 400 men. The night before that meeting, Jacob sent his family across a river called the Jabbok, and he stayed behind alone. And a man came out of the darkness and wrestled with him until the sky started to lighten. Scripture never fully explains who this was. Jacob himself was not sure, not until the very end. They fought for hours. Neither one backed down. Finally, the stranger touched Jacob's hip and threw it out of joint with what seems to have taken no effort at all. And even then Jacob would not let go. "Bless me," Jacob said. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And the stranger asked him a question first. "What is your name?" "Jacob." The name itself meant deceiver, heel grabber, the one who takes another man's place. Saying it out loud was a confession. You can probably feel how much it must have cost him to say his own name honestly, out loud, to a stranger who already seemed to know the answer. "You will no longer be called Jacob," the stranger said. "Your name is Israel, because you have wrestled with God and with men, and you have prevailed." Israel. In the Hebrew, Yisrael, the one who wrestles with God. Some scholars translate it slightly differently. God contends, God fights on this one's behalf. But either reading says the same thing underneath. This was not a reward for good behavior. This was a name given to a man still limping, still frightened, still hours away from facing the brother he had betrayed. This is what most people miss about this moment too. You do not get a clean ending before you get a new name. You get the new name in the middle of the mess, while your hip is still out of joint, while your enemy is still marching toward you. Both times, the name came before the ending was written. Abraham did not have Isaac yet. Israel did not know if Esau would embrace him or kill him. God kept doing this, speaking of future identity over people who were still standing in the wreckage of their old one. 2 names down. 2 people who were given a future before they had any proof they deserved one. But you are only halfway through this list, and the next 2 names belong to men who were, in their own ways, further from deserving a new identity than anyone we have talked about so far. If you want to see where this goes, stay with me, and if this kind of story matters to you, take a second to subscribe, because we go through moments like this every week. Simon was a fisherman. Loud, impulsive, the kind of man who spoke before he thought and then had to live with what he said. When Jesus first met him, on the shore of a lake called Galilee, he did not compliment him. He renamed him on the spot. "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Peter." Peter in the Greek, Petros, meaning rock, not a pebble. A rock, the kind you build something permanent on top of. And here is what makes this name almost unbearable to read if you know what happens next. This same man 3 years later would deny even knowing Jesus. 3 times. In one night, while Jesus was being tried a few feet away. If you have ever failed at the exact thing you promised yourself you never would, you already understand what it cost Peter to hear a rooster crow that morning. You would think a name like that gets revoked after a failure like that. It didn't. Because the name was never a statement about who Simon already was. It was a statement about who Peter was going to be, the one who would stand up in front of thousands after the resurrection and preach the first sermon of the church, and preach the first fight died down in Rome, rather eventually crucified upside down in Rome. rather than deny his Lord a second time. The rock was named before it had finished cracking. Sit with that for a second, because it changes how you might read your own worst failure. And then there is the name that changes hardest to say out loud, because of who carried it first. Saul hunted Christians. That is not an exaggeration to make a point. He held official letters giving him authority to drag men and women out of their homes in Damascus and imprison them for following Jesus. He was present, approving, when a man named Stevens, the historian Josephus, and several early church writers placed Saul firmly in this era of persecution, a young zealot, certain he was serving God by destroying what he thought was a dangerous lie. On the road to Damascus, a light knocked him to the ground and blinded him for 3 days. When his sight returned, something else had changed too. Somewhere between that road and his first mission to the churches of Asia Minor became Paul, and the man who once carried arrest warrants for Christians began carrying letters that Christians would read for the next 2,000 years. If you have ever wondered whether your worst season disqualifies you from what comes next, you already know Paul's answer to that question, even if you have never read a word he wrote. This is not a story about a number. This is not a story about a single verse. This is not a story about a doctrine written to sound impressive. This is a story about every time God bent down to someone who was still afraid, still guilty, still limping, still holding the wrong name, and gave them a new one anyway. 4 names. 2 men, 2 women, all of them broken in some specific way before God spoke over them. But there is a 5th name in this story, and it was never given to a single person. After Paul's conversion, the message about Jesus began spreading beyond Jerusalem, carried by ordinary believers into a city called Antioch, a large, mixed, pagan city in what is now southern Turkey. And there, for the first time recorded in Scripture, the followers of Jesus were given a name that was not their own idea. The people of Antioch started calling them Christianoi, Christians, little Christs. It may have started as an insult, the way outsiders often name a group before that group claims the name for itself. It did not stay an insult for long. Think about what that means for you specifically, not just for people in a history book. Abraham's name change was personal. Israel's was personal. Peter's was personal. Paul's was personal. But this one belonged to a whole community, ordinary people, most of them with no dramatic road to Damascus story, no wrestling match by a river, no divine visit in the middle of the night. Just people who had decided to follow someone and were renamed for it anyway. Do you remember the name we planted at the very beginning? The 5th name, not written the way the others were, the one you might already be carrying. This is it. If you have ever called yourself a Christian, you are standing in the same line as Abraham laughing in the dirt, Israel limping toward his brother, Peter still carrying the memory of every letter of his denial, and Paul still carrying the memory of every letter he once signed to imprison people, like the one he became. None of them earned the name first. Every one of them was renamed before the story finished proving them right. Is the beginning of the most with yourself, you probably already know which one of them you resemble most right now. There is a strange comfort tucked into that if you think about your own 3 o'clock in the morning moments, the ones where you are certain the old name, the failed name, the ashamed name is the only one that still fits you. Scripture keeps insisting otherwise. It keeps showing people renamed in the middle of their mess, not after they cleaned it up. You do not have to finish becoming someone before God is willing to call you by the new name. So here is what this really comes down to for you watching this right now. First, the plain fact. 5 names, 5 transformations, one God who kept doing this across 2,000 years of history. From a childless old man in the desert to an entire city full of strangers. Second, what it means for you. If God changed the names of people mid-failure, mid-fear, mid-guilt, then the name He has for you was very likely decided long before you finished proving yourself either way. And third, and this is the part that should actually unsettle you a little, the name you call yourself every morning, in your own head, when no one else is listening, might not be the name God is calling you. Jacob called himself a deceiver for decades. God had already decided to call him Israel. If you had to guess, which one of these 5 renamings hits closest to something in your own life? Abraham's long wait, Israel's wrestling match, Peter's failure, Paul's past, or the quiet, ordinary naming that happened to a whole city full of nobodies. Tell me which one in the comments and tell me why. Because somewhere in a desert, an old man once knelt in the sand and heard a name that sounded ridiculous. And 2,000 years later, you are still saying it.